On April 20, Andrii Melnyk stood before the United Nations Security Council and did something Vladimir Putin has spent 4 years preventing anyone from doing in front of an international audience. He spoke the math out loud. To take the rest of Donetsk by military force, Melnyk told the council, Russia would need to absorb at least 1.5 million additional casualties. He called Putin's demand that Ukraine simply cede the territory pure blackmail. He compared Russia's failures in Donetsk to the 1939 Winter War, where the Soviet Union had absorbed casualty rates 100 times lower and still failed against Finland. And then he sat down, having transformed Putin's diplomatic ultimatum into the public confession of a leader who knows his army cannot win. What follows is the story of how a diplomatic strategy built on bluff finally collided with the math that exposed it. Of Putin's pivot from military conquest to ultimatum-based extraction, a pivot that reveals his understanding that the Donetsk campaign cannot succeed by force. Of Russia's chief of the General Staff, Andrii Gerasimov, claiming his army has captured 1,700 square kilometers of Ukraine in 2026, when open-source data documents fewer than 400. Of a Russian president reportedly going around with his cap in his hand, asking the country's wealthiest oligarchs for war funding because the state budget can no longer cover the bill. And of a September deadline for Donbas, capture that mathematically cannot be met. But this story does not begin at the Security Council. It begins with Putin's pivot the moment a military demand became a diplomatic one, and what that pivot quietly revealed about everything Russia had been claiming for years. The pivot was visible in the language. For most of the war, Putin had framed Donetsk as a region that Russia would liberate and protect a military operation against an illegitimate Ukrainian government. As the casualty rates rose and territorial gains slowed, the framing shifted. By 2026, Putin was demanding that Ukraine withdraw from Donetsk by the end of May, an ultimatum delivered as if from a position of strength, but in language that revealed the position was not strong at all. Military operations conducted from a position of strength do not require the opposing party to withdraw. They simply continue until the position is taken. Putin's demand for Ukrainian withdrawal acknowledged what his military operations had failed to demonstrate, that Russia could not take Donetsk by force in any reasonable time frame. The numbers Melnyk presented at the UN made this acknowledgement explicit. Russia controls less than 20% of the Donetsk region. Approximately 6,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian-held Donetsk remain territory that includes hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian civilians whom any ceded surrender would condemn to Russian occupation. At Russia's all-Ukraine casualty rate of 254 per square kilometer disclosed by Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov in April, taking that territory would cost Russia 1.524 million casualties. At the Donetsk-specific rate of 428 per square kilometer that Fedorov also confirmed, the figure rises to 2.568 million. Russia has lost approximately 1.32 million casualties across the entire war from February 2022 to April 2026. To take Donetsk by force, Russia would need to roughly double or triple the cumulative casualty count of the war so far. Putin knows this. His general staff knows this. Anyone with access to honest reporting in the Kremlin knows this. The ultimatum strategy exists because the military strategy does not work. Quick note, you're watching Iron Brief. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. The Russian response to the gap between claim and reality has been to inflate the claim. In mid-April 2026, Russia's chief of the General Staff, Andrii Gerasimov, who has been here before, repeatedly providing optimistic battlefield assessments that subsequent reporting has consistently contradicted, announced that Russian forces had captured over 1,700 square kilometers of Ukraine in 2026, including 700 square kilometers and 34 settlements during the spring offensive. The Institute for the Study of War's open-source analysis directly contradicts this. According to ISW's documented assessment based on geolocated combat footage and verified reporting, Russia has captured 381.5 square kilometers and 13 settlements in 2026, less than a quarter of Gerasimov's stated figure. Even the most generous alternative estimates put the figure no higher than 715 square kilometers. Russia is not merely making slow progress and exaggerating it. Russia is making minimal progress in fabricating its scale. The fabrication compounds. According to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in an April 1 report, Putin used a March meeting with Russian business elites to ask the country's wealthiest oligarchs to contribute their profits to the state war budget rather than reinvesting in their businesses. The pitch reportedly worked. Suleiman Kerimov, a prominent Russian oligarch, allegedly handed over $1.23 billion. Other oligarchs reportedly agreed to contribute as well. This is not the behavior of a state operating from a position of military strength. This is the behavior of a state whose conventional fiscal mechanisms can no longer fund its war, and whose leader is reduced to asking private citizens for direct contributions. The supposed three-day operation that was meant to be over in February 2022 is now requiring oligarchic charity to continue in spring 2026. But Melnyk's speech is not exceptional. It is the rule of what happens when a military operation built on assumed quick victory is forced to account publicly for its actual cost. The pattern repeats across the historical record. The 1939, 1940 Winter War, which Melnyk explicitly cited at the Security Council, saw the Soviet Union absorb casualty rates approximately 100 times lower per square kilometer than Russia is now absorbing. In Donetsk, and still fail to conquer Finland, the Soviets ultimately settled for control of approximately 9% of Finnish territory through treaty negotiations. Russia in 2026 is demanding control of 100% of Donetsk, while suffering casualty rates that would have shocked the Soviet General Staff in 1940. The historical lesson is that even imperial systems with vast manpower reserves and political tolerance for casualties cannot indefinitely sustain offensive operations whose math has fundamentally broken. Vadim Skibitsky, deputy head of Ukraine's main directorate of intelligence, has indicated that Russia has set a September 2026 deadline for Donbas capture. The Institute for the Study of War's projection based on current operational tempo and casualty rates places the fortress belt's fall no earlier than late 2027, with high probability of slipping into 2028. The September deadline cannot be met. What Russia does when the deadline passes is the question now hanging over every aspect of the war. Putin has staked his political legitimacy on the war. The war has now been demonstrated in public at the United Nations Security Council to be a strategic dead end whose continuation requires casualty rates the Russian state cannot indefinitely absorb. The escape valves, military victory, diplomatic concession, or strategic withdrawal each lead to outcomes Putin cannot accept while remaining in power. But this is only the surface, because what Putin's pivot from military conquest to diplomatic blackmail reveals about the structural fragility of authoritarian power projection will reshape how the world calculates the cost of negotiating with regimes whose public positions are built on hidden weakness. Putin's demand for Donetsk is not a negotiation. It is an attempt to extract through diplomatic pressure what military force cannot deliver. Acknowledging that publicly, as Melnyk did on April 20, fundamentally changes the dynamics of any future negotiation. Russia is not bargaining from strength. It is bargaining from a position whose mathematics every analyst can now verify. The blackmail has been named, the leverage has been exposed. And once leverage has been publicly exposed, it ceases to function as leverage. The question Putin cannot answer publicly is the only one that matters. There is no version of the Donetsk campaign that arithmetic supports. There is no diplomatic settlement that legitimizes territorial conquest Russia has not actually made. There is no political path for Putin that does not require either military victory, the math forbids, or diplomatic acceptance his regime cannot survive. Andrii Melnyk's speech at the Security Council on April 20 was not a diplomatic statement. It was a public exposure performed in front of every government in the world of the strategic position Putin has spent 4 years pretending he does not occupy. The pretending is over. The math is on the record. And Russia's options are now the same options Russia had before Melnyk spoke, but everyone now knows what they actually are. If you want to understand the casualty mathematics that Melnyk's speech laid out, check out our breakdown of the 254 versus 428 figures and what they reveal about Russian doctrine. And if you want to see how Russia's domestic financial collapse is forcing the kind of oligarch-based fundraising that Putin reportedly requested, Our analysis of the Russian war economy will show you the full picture. Subscribe to Iron Brief so you never miss what comes next.